Hey everybody, it's Quentin, as usual. So here's the deal. For my school, well, my old school, the school I just graduated from, the one that I went to high school at, I am going in March to do a presentation on the medicalization of sexual orientations and gender identities for the Gender and Sexualities course that runs out of that school. It's the first one of its kind in the province, the first high school level gender and sexualities course. It's really interesting. It was a great introduction to gender and sexualities. I took it last semester, and I had a great time with it. It was a really good course, and they allowed me to take a lot of personal direction on it, so I had an excellent time in that course. Anyway, today I am going to read out what I have so far for my presentation for this subject. So here goes. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, published by the American Psychiatric Association, is North America's primary document used by clinicians to diagnose and recommend appropriate treatment for individuals presenting with mental illnesses. The first edition of the DSM was published in 1952, with subsequent editions in 1968, 1980, 1987, 1994, and 2000. Homosexuality is classified as a form of mental illness in the DSM-1 under the heading Sexual Deviation in the category of personality disorders. This is also the heading under which transgenderism or transsexualism is labeled, as transvestism in accordance with semantics of the time. Quote, sexual deviation. This diagnosis is reserved for deviant sexuality which is not symptomatic of more extensive syndromes such as schizophrenic and obsessional reactions. The term includes most of the cases formerly classed as psychopathic personality with pathologic sexuality. The diagnosis will specify the type of the pathologic behavior, such as homosexuality, transvestism, pedophilia, fetishism, and sexual sadism, including rape, sexual assault, and mutilation. DSM page 38 to 39, end quote. And so homosexuality was classified and asserted as a valid mental illness, which then gave credence to certain individuals who sought to treat homosexuality. The rising gay and lesbian rights movement in North America sought to declassify homosexuality as a mental illness and remove it from the DSM-1 and all future editions. The second edition of the DSM gave homosexuality its own numerical code, also under the heading Sexual Deviations. Quote, even though many find their practices distasteful, they remain unable to substitute normal sexual behavior for them. End quote. DSM-2, page 44. This passage seems to foreshadow the APA's 73 decision to exclude homosexuality as a form of mental illness by acknowledging that some people, including some homosexuals, find their practices distasteful and are distressed or upset by them. However, a hint of judgmental tone remains in this passage. It can be inferred that this volume may not be without its own biases. Gay rights activists were largely successful, and by 1973, homosexuality was only considered a form of mental illness if it was ego-dystonic. That is, if it was present even if a patient wished otherwise, and if that patient experienced significant distress over their condition. This change was reflected in the third, 1980 edition of the DSM. Quote, the removal of homosexuality per se from DSM-2 was supported by the following rationale. The crucial issue in determining whether or not homosexuality per se should be regarded as mental disorder is not the etiology of the condition, but its consequences and the definition of mental disorder. End quote. DSM-3, page 380. By the time of the DSM-4 in 1994, homosexuality and ego-dystonic homosexuality were no longer considered mental illnesses for clinical and or political reasons and were not listed. Homosexuality is mentioned as a possible component of both transvestic fetishism and gender identity disorder, but not in the context of illness. In the context of gender identity disorder, the DSM-4 mentions that a large proportion of boys diagnosed with this illness go on to develop as homosexuals or bisexuals without active gender identity disorder. The decision whether or not to include homosexuality and transsexuality or transgenderism as mental illness codified in the DSM is largely a political one, and the actions of the American Psychiatric Association mostly reflect the changing political climate in North America and the gradual acceptance, first of homosexuality and now of transsexuality and transgenderism, by mainstream society. As mentioned before, transsexuality and transgenderism first appear in the DSM-1 in 1952 as transvestism. Like homosexuality, transvestitism received its own code number in the DSM-2 under the heading sexual deviation. There is no further explanation of what transvestitism is or how it could possibly be treated. The next appearance of transsexuality is in the DSM-3. This marks the first notable use of the term gender identity disorder to describe someone with gender dysphoria or someone who somehow transgresses gender boundaries. Quote, "The essential features of this heterogeneous disorder are a persistent sense of discomfort and inappropriateness about one's anatomic sex, and a persistent wish to be rid of one's genitals and to live as a member of the other sex." End quote. DSM-3, page 261 to 262. Many transsexuals at the time, and currently, were upset by this classification because it effectively ruled out any trans people who did not wish to, quote, "be rid of their genitals," end quote. Not all trans people are or were clamoring for a potentially risky and expensive surgery on a very delicate body part. However, this is an example of how transsexuality has been medicalized by the American Psychiatric Association and other associations. How it always comes back to matters of surgery, matters of medical concern. There is a growing movement in trans activist circles to have gender identity disorder removed from subsequent editions of the DSM. Indeed, this argument was alive even before the formation of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 4. Trans activists argue that the classification of GID as a mental illness, or even titling it as gender identity disorder, stigmatizes the condition for people who experience it. Many individuals with GID, or as some prefer to call it, gender dysphoria, do not see themselves as mentally ill. However, there are a few arguments for maintaining GID's status as a codified mental illness. These arguments are, for the most part, extrapolated from Ira B. Pauley's Terminology and Classification of Gender Identity Disorders, published in 1992. 1. Transsexuality is actually statistically rare, very much more so than homosexuality, so it is difficult to legitimately state that it is just another variant of the human condition. However, could it not be possible that transsexuality really is a variant, however rare, of the human condition? There are certain strains of research underway that seek to prove that transsexuality can be definitively linked to a certain chromosomal or biological pattern present from before the time of birth. This would effectively ratify it as a